The Vietnam War started with Presidents John F. Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. These men majorly impacted the U.S. to get involved in the Vietnam War.
President John F. Kennedy strongly believed in the domino theory. He had hopes that if one country fell and eliminated communism, all of the small countries in South Vietnam would too. He was extremely eager to show the U.S. strength. Past incidents like the Bay of Pigs and the Berlin Wall really made Kennedy hope that aiding Vietnam would demonstrate the U.S. continued strength. When Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson took over as president. He believed that if the U.S. expanded their military in Vietnam, that a communist victory could be stopped. Johnson wanted a larger U.S. military because northern Vietnamese forces moving into South Vietnam were at a very rapid and increasing pace. Johnson needed authority from Congress, and the Gulf of Tonkin gave him that. On August 4th of 1964, Johnson announced that the USS Maddox had been attacked by northern Vietnamese torpedo boats. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution enabled that the president could do whatever was needed to protect them from attacking forces. This gave Johnson the authority to expand the war. During the Vietnam War, nobody wanted to be a part of the draft. The U.S. government heavily relied on drafted soldiers. 25% of men couldn't enter the war because of health issues. So men that had serious medical issues could not be entered in the war. 30% of men received deferments. Deferments were postponements for men to enter the war. Also, if men were in college, they received deferments, so many people entered the war after this. Therefore, students made sure to keep their grades up, because if not, draft boards could cancel their deferment easily. Many African Americans took up a high percentage of the military. Therefore, African Americans had the highest casualty rates. In 1969, the government instituted a lottery system that chose men based on when they were born. The draft became more fair, but ended in 1973 to recruit volunteers.
Anti-war protesters rose out from the public. Doves was a name for people who were against the war, believed it was taking attention away from problems in society. The anti-war movement included college students who held rallies and debates on campus, and faculty members who held teach-ins to educate people on the war. As the anti-war movement grew, events occurred that would affect the United States forever. On April 30th, 1970, President Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia and needed to draft more soldiers. After hearing this, anti-war activists at Kent State University set fire to the ROTC building on May 2nd, 1970. On May 4th, students gathered for an anti-war rally. Ohio governor sent in the National Guard. When the troops asked the students to leave, they threw rocks and insulted them. Soldiers then started firing at the protesters, which killed 4 and injured 9. Some students who were shot weren't even part of the protest. This event horrified the nation. They were furious how the troops treated the students as terrorists or criminals. Also, after examining the bodies, the students were shot in the back of the head, showing that they were running away, not advancing towards the troops. After this incident, campuses nationwide went on strike, which caused almost 500 colleges to shut down or be disrupted by protests. The My Lai massacre also sparked outrage and mistrust from the people of the United States. In 1969, the My Lai incident was leaked to Americans, which occurred in 1968. Under the command of Lieutenant William Calley, troops entered the village to find Viet Cong fighters. When none were found, the troops killed at least 450 women, children, and elderly men. This was kept a secret until the former soldiers began to talk. This also increased the opposition of U.S. involvement in the war. The brutality of the military frightened the American people. Since the military covered it up, the public couldn't trust them. Also, because the government backed up the military, so the public didn't trust them either. In 1971, New York Times published a collection of secret government documents about the history of U.S. In 1971, New York Times published a collection of secret government documents about the history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam since Truman presidency. This revealed that government officials had been misleading the American people about the war for years. This breaking news awakened the public that the government used the power the people gave to them to manipulate them. All these events increased the opposition of the war.
In the Vietnam War, there were many difficulties in physically fighting the war. Two types of warfare used during the war was ground war and aerial war. The ground war was so difficult to fight on because of its terrain. Most of the fighting in Vietnam took place in a hot, wet jungle terrain. Soldiers would have heat strokes, malaria, trench foot, fungi, and infections. The jungles that they were fighting in were so thick that it was hard to determine who the enemy was. Booby traps and constant ambushes from people they thought they were fighting for. It was very hard to identify the enemy because they dressed as civilians. At the time, using aerial warfare was not much of a problem. The only problem with using the warfare is that it killed civilians. But most of the air warfare was the use of defoulement to ease locating the North Vietnam Army. The product they used was known as Agent Orange. Was not when they were using the chemical, but the after effect that showed up years later. People that were exposed may suffer from heart disease, types of cancer, and rashes. This was a problem because over 4 million people were exposed to it.
On January 31st, 1968, 70,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a coordinated series of fierce attacks on more than 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam. Nguyen Giap, leader of PAVN, planned the Tet Offensive in an attempt to encourage the United States to scale back its support of Saigon Regiment. North Vietnam took a strategic victory. Even though the U.S. and the South Vietnamese held them off, the public was shocked and the support for the war lessened. Before the Tet Offensive, the Johnson administration had been saying that the end of the war was in sight. The attacks marked the turning point in the Vietnam War and the beginning of a slow, painful withdrawal from the region.
President Nixon used a policy called Vietnamization. This was put in place to end the U.S.'s involvement in the war. He did this by transferring all the military responsibilities over to South Vietnam. In order for the U.S. to back out of the war, South Vietnam would have to admit and take all responsibility for taking defense against a communism takeover. The U.S. and North Vietnam made a treaty to withdraw the U.S. troops. Vietnamization was a successful plan of Nixon's, which affected the U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War.
In conclusion to the Vietnam War, neither side won or lost. A major component to the war coming to an end was a failed attack in 1972 called the Eastern Offense. It was an attack performed by North Vietnam on South. Also, the war was becoming too costly and there was no real gain. In 1973, a peace treaty was signed and Sato left South Vietnam, because the war was become unpopular and useless. This is the conclusion to our documentary. The end.